Candace Craig. On May 2023, authorities in Prince George's County, Maryland, responded to a wellness check that would reveal one of the most disturbing cases in recent memory. Inside the home, investigators discovered the dismembered remains of 71-year-old Margaret Craig. What began as concerns about an elderly woman's welfare quickly became a homicide investigation that would expose a daughter's calculated actions driven by financial greed. Margaret Craig had confronted her daughter, 46-year-old Candace Craig, about missing money. Margaret's pension and Social Security funds had been systematically stolen, with Candace accessing the accounts without permission over an extended period. This financial dependency had created a situation where Candace couldn't afford to let her mother live to report the theft or cut off access to the funds. When Margaret discovered the extent of the stealing and confronted her daughter, the confrontation ended fatally. The exact method of how Margaret lost her life remains unclear, with the defense arguing during trial that we have no idea how Margaret Craig died due to the condition of the remains. What is known is what happened afterward. Candace used a chainsaw to dismember her mother's body, placing the remains in bags and paint cans. She then attempted to destroy the evidence by burning the remains, purchasing a gas can, charcoal, and a lighter for this purpose. Candace didn't act entirely alone in the cover-up. Her 21-year-old daughter, Salia Hardy, who has a developmental condition, became involved in the disposal efforts. Hardy testified at trial that she helped her mother because "my mother asked me." The young woman described the scene, explaining how she assisted at Candace's direction, believing she had no choice but to comply with her mother's demands. Hardy purchased supplies and participated in the attempted disposal. Actions she later said were done out of obligation to her mother, rather than understanding of what was truly happening. The investigation began when concerned family members requested the wellness check. Body camera footage from responding officers captured disturbing smells and sights at the scene that immediately raised red flags. Forensic examination of the home revealed the extent of what had occurred. The physical evidence, combined with financial records showing the pattern of theft, built a comprehensive case against Candace. At trial in November 2024, prosecutors presented evidence of financial motive alongside the forensic findings. Assistant State's Attorney Shauna Coleman highlighted how Candace attempted to blame her daughters, calling her the mastermind behind both the initial act and the cover-up attempts. Hardy's testimony proved crucial, as she explained how her mother had directed her actions and manipulated her participation. The jury convicted Candace of first-degree charges after hearing the full scope of the evidence. Hardy, recognizing her limited understanding and manipulation by her mother, accepted a plea agreement. In December 2024, she pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact and received 5 years of supervised probation, a sentence that reflected the court's understanding of her developmental challenges and her mother's exploitation of those challenges. On February 19, 2025, Prince George's County Circuit Court sentenced Candace Craig to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But financial motives aren't the only triggers that lead daughters down dark paths. Heather Barbera. In July 2018, 43-year-old Heather Barbera was living in her family's condo in Ventnor, New Jersey. She had recently moved in after leaving her husband in Mississippi, arriving without employment or clear plans for her future. The household included her 67-year-old mother, Michelle Gordon, who worked as a patient care technician, and her 87-year-old grandmother, Elaine Rosen, originally from Philadelphia. The living arrangement quickly became strained as the family tensions that had simmered for years reached a breaking point. The family dynamic had long been troubled. Reports described a toxic and unhealthy family dynamic, marked by dysfunction throughout Heather's life. Mental health struggles, substance issues, and long-standing conflicts created an environment where small disagreements could escalate rapidly. The situation had been made worse by the recent passing of Heather's brother from a substance-related incident just months before, a loss that affected everyone in the household differently and added to the existing tensions. Heather's grandmother, Elaine, had expressed concerns about allowing Heather to stay in the condo. Rosen had warned against letting her stay due to her troubles, recognizing patterns of behavior that worried her. Heather's husband, still in Mississippi, had also noted her mental health decline during the period before she moved back to New Jersey. These warning signs, however, didn't prevent the family from taking her in, hoping that returning home might provide the stability she seemed to need. On the day of the incident, a heated argument erupted in the condo. The specifics of what triggered the argument remain unclear, but the confrontation escalated beyond words. Heather struck her mother with a flashlight, then retrieved a nightstick that had belonged to her deceased father, a former NYPD officer. She used this weapon to strike both her mother and grandmother repeatedly. The attack continued until both women lay incapacitated, suffering from severe trauma. After the assault, Heather didn't call for help or attempt to assist the injured women. Instead, she cleaned herself up and gathered valuables from the condo. She stole cash, jewelry, and credit cards, then left the residence while both victims were still alive but gravely injured. She made her way to New York City, leaving her mother and grandmother to perish without medical intervention. The bodies were discovered by Heather's uncle, Richard Rosen, after he failed to reach his mother and sister through normal communication channels. His wellness check revealed the horrific scene and immediately launched a homicide investigation. Law enforcement quickly identified Heather as a suspect based on her absence and the evidence at the scene. Heather was located and arrested days later at New York City's Port Authority bus terminal. Investigators tracked her through purchases made with the stolen credit cards, following a trail of transactions that led them directly to her location. When apprehended, she was found in possession of items taken from the condo in October 2019. Heather pleaded guilty to different charges for each victim. First-degree charges for her grandmother's ending and aggravated manslaughter for her mother's. The distinction reflected different legal considerations for each case, though both involved the same incident and weapon. On January 9, 2020, Atlantic County Superior Court Judge Bernard Delury sentenced Heather to a total of 42 years, 30 years for her grandmother's case and 12 consecutive years for her mother's case. She will be eligible for parole consideration after serving 40 years. Prosecutor Allison Iselin characterized the acts as heinous, cruel, or depraved, emphasizing the breach of family trust and the choice to steal and flee rather than seek help for the injured women. During sentencing, Heather offered a soft apology, saying, "I never wanted any of this to happen," though she provided no detailed explanation for her actions. Her husband indicated plans to appeal, believing the acts should be considered heat-of-passion manslaughter rather than the more serious charges to which she had pleaded guilty. Sometimes relationships with partners spark the most devastating family conflicts. Sarah Marie Johnson. On September 2, 2003, emergency responders rushed to a home in Bellevue, Idaho, following a frantic call. What they found was a scene of shocking devastation. Inside the house, 55-year-old Alan Johnson and 46-year-old Diane Johnson had both been shot. Alan had been struck in the chest while in the shower, and Diane had been shot in the head while sleeping in bed. The house was covered in blood and tissue, indicating the close-range nature of the attacks. 16-year-old Sarah Marie Johnson, the couple's daughter, had fled to a neighbor's house, claiming there had been a shooting. She became the immediate focus of the investigation as detectives worked to understand what had happened in the Johnson home that morning. The weapon used was identified as a .264 caliber rifle that belonged to a guest house tenant named Mel Spiegel. Though Spiegel was cleared after establishing he was out of town when the incident occurred. As investigators examined the scene and interviewed Sarah, a motive began to emerge. Sarah had been dating 19-year-old Bruno Santos, a relationship her parents strongly disapproved of. Santos's immigration status added complexity to the situation, and Alan had reportedly threatened to pursue legal action regarding the relationship, including potential statutory concerns given Sarah's status. The conflict between Sarah's desire to continue the relationship and her parents' opposition had created significant household tension in the weeks before their lives ended. Physical evidence proved crucial in building the case. DNA belonging to Sarah was found inside a latex glove that also contained blood from both victims. A bloody robe discovered in the trash was matched to Sarah. She also had a bruise consistent with rifle recoil, suggesting she had recently fired the weapon used in the shootings. While no fingerprints on the rifle matched Sarah's, and some unidentified prints remained unexplained, the combination of other evidence pointed strongly toward her involvement. Sarah's account of the morning's events contained inconsistencies that troubled investigators. Her statements about her location, her actions, and the timeline didn't align with the physical evidence or with the pattern of what had occurred. These contradictions, combined with the forensic findings, led prosecutors to charge her as an adult despite her status at the time. The trial took place in 2005, spanning 5 weeks as prosecutors presented their evidence and the defense attempted to create reasonable doubt. The jury ultimately convicted Sarah of 2 counts of first-degree charges, finding that the evidence established her guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The conviction meant she would face significant prison time despite her youth at the time of the offense. On June 30th, 2005, Judge Barry Wood imposed sentencing. Sarah received concurrent life terms plus 15 years for firearm enhancements, ensuring she would spend decades in prison before it saw any possibility of parole consideration. In delivering the sentence, Judge Wood addressed Sarah directly, telling her, "You had it all. You elected the worst possible courses of conduct." His words reflected his view that Sarah had come from a privileged background with opportunities many don't have, yet chose to resolve a family conflict through the most extreme means imaginable. Sarah maintained her innocence throughout the trial and afterward. She told a psychiatrist, "I did not commit these acts," a position she has continued to hold during her incarceration. Her steadfast denial has been central to various appeals filed over the years. The appeals process has been extensive. A significant appeal in 2014 sought post-conviction relief, arguing ineffective assistance of counsel and challenging various aspects of the trial. The Idaho Supreme Court denied this appeal, upholding the original conviction and finding that the defense had been adequate and the evidence sufficient. As of 2025, Sarah remains in prison, serving her life sentences. Educational pressures can also create unbearable situations for some young people. Nicole Nachtman. In August 2015, residents of a Carrollwood, Florida neighborhood heard gunshots followed by terrifying screams. The sounds came from the home of Miriam and Robert Denis, a couple who lived with Miriam's daughter from a previous relationship. Neighbors who heard the disturbance described the screams as filled with agony or disbelief, sounds that would later take on heartbreaking meaning as the full scope of what occurred became clear. Nicole Nachtman, a former Florida State University student, had been struggling. She had failed to secure housing for the upcoming school term, a problem she had hidden from her parents rather than confronting it directly. This deception had created a situation where she would eventually need to explain to Miriam and Robert why she wasn't returning to school as expected. Rather than face that conversation and the consequences of her failure to handle her responsibilities, Nicole made a catastrophic choice. Nicole shot her mother, Miriam, in the driveway of their home, then entered the house and shot her stepfather, Robert. The attacks were sudden and gave neither parent the opportunity to defend themselves or escape. Both lost their lives from the gunshot injuries. The weapon used was a firearm accessible in the household, and Nicole's familiarity with the home allowed her to carry out the plan efficiently. After the incident, Nicole reached out to her brother, Joseph Carey. She confessed to him what she had done, providing details that only the person responsible could know. Her brother contacted authorities, leading to Nicole's swift arrest. The confession to a family member proved to be a key piece of evidence in the subsequent prosecution. The case took an unusual turn when Nicole's behavior while in jail raised concerns. She made jokes referencing Disney's Frozen and exhibited other behavior that seemed inappropriate given the gravity of her situation. These actions became relevant to the defense strategy that would be presented at trial, as attorneys argued about Nicole's mental state and capacity. The defense built its case around claims of mental illness and household dysfunction. Attorneys argued that Miriam had fat-shamed her and made her get liposuction, painting a picture of a household where Nicole felt constantly criticized and controlled regarding her appearance. They claimed she had experienced ongoing emotional harm that contributed to a psychotic break. The defense pursued an insanity plea, arguing Nicole didn't understand right from wrong at the time of the acts. Prosecutors countered this narrative by presenting evidence that Nicole knew exactly what she was doing. They argued that her actions were calculated responses to avoid facing consequences for her academic and housing failures, not the result of a mental break. The prosecution emphasized that Nicole's behavior showed planning and awareness of consequences, undermining claims that she lacked comprehension of her actions. The trial in 2019 captured significant public attention. After 12 hours of jury deliberation, the verdict came back: guilty on 2 counts of first-degree charges. The jury had rejected the insanity defense, finding that Nicole understood right from wrong, despite any mental health challenges she may have faced. They concluded that whatever household tensions existed, they didn't excuse or explain the choice to take 2 lives, rather than face an uncomfortable conversation about school housing. Sentencing occurred immediately following the guilty verdict. Nicole received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for both convictions, meaning she will spend the rest of her life in the Florida prison system. Mental health claims take center stage in the next case as well. Sidney Powell. In March 2020, 19-year-old Sidney Powell was at her Akron, Ohio, home, while her mother, 50-year-old Brenda Powell, spoke on the phone with school officials. The call concerned Sidney's suspension from Mount Union University, a development that had created tension in the household. What happened next would become one of Ohio's most contested cases regarding mental health defenses and legal proceedings. During the phone call, the situation escalated dramatically. Sidney struck her mother with an iron skillet, then proceeded to stab Brenda nearly 30 times in the neck area. The attack was sustained and severe, continuing well beyond what would have been necessary to incapacitate. By the time it ended, Brenda had suffered fatal injuries from which she could not recover. The scene left no doubt about the intensity and duration of the assault. The case from its earliest stages involved significant focus on Sidney's mental health. Experts who evaluated Sidney described her as having one of the most severe cases of mental illness they had encountered. She had been diagnosed with multiple conditions, including anxiety, borderline personality traits, and schizoaffective disorder. These diagnoses formed the foundation of the defense strategy, with attorneys arguing that Sydney's actions stemmed from severe psychiatric illness rather than criminal intent. The defense pursued an insanity plea, presenting testimony from mental health professionals who had evaluated Sydney both before and after the incident. They argued that her psychiatric conditions had reached a crisis point, resulting in a break from reality during which she could not appreciate the wrongfulness of her actions or control her behavior. The defense painted a picture of a young woman in the grip of severe mental illness who needed treatment rather than punishment. Prosecutors took a different view of the evidence. The state's expert witness testified that Powell tended to exaggerate symptoms, suggesting that while Sydney might have genuine mental health challenges, she was overstating their severity and their impact on her behavior. The prosecution argued that Sydney understood what she was doing and chose to act despite that understanding, making this a criminal matter rather than purely a medical one. In 2023, a jury convicted Sydney of charges including the primary offense, assault, and evidence tampering. The verdict indicated the jury found her legally responsible for her actions, despite the mental health evidence presented. Following the conviction, Sydney received a sentence of 15 years to life, meaning she would serve at least 15 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration. As Sydney awaits her new trial, the fundamental questions remain. Was she in the grip of mental illness so severe that she couldn't control or understand her actions? Or did she retain enough awareness and control to be held criminally responsible despite her diagnoses? A new jury will eventually be asked to make that determination, with the outcome potentially affecting how Sydney spends the rest of her life. The role of caregiver can bring its own unique pressures and breaking points. Rachel Zamaripa. On August 31st, 2024, emergency services in Bazar County, Texas, received a call that would reveal the tragic outcome of mounting caregiver stress. 21-year-old Rachel Zamaripa had called to confess that she had just taken her mother's life. When first responders arrived at the residence, they found 58-year-old Linda Zamaripa with over 24 stab wounds to her chest area. The knife remained lodged in Linda's chest, a stark visual representation of the intensity of the attack. Rachel had been serving as her mother's primary caregiver, a role that carried significant responsibilities for someone barely into adulthood. Linda's condition required constant attention and limited her ability to leave the home independently. This meant Rachel had become not just a caregiver, but essentially her mother's only regular connection to the outside world. Rachel was also the sole provider for the household, handling both caregiving duties and financial responsibilities that would challenge someone much older and more established. The pressure of these combined roles had been building. Caring for a parent while managing all household finances and having no ability to step away from those responsibilities created an environment where stress accumulated with no outlet for relief. Rachel felt trapped by her mother's inability to leave home, a situation that meant she couldn't pursue normal activities for someone her age, couldn't develop her own life separate from her caregiver role, and couldn't escape the constant demands that came with being someone's sole source of support. According to authorities, Rachel reached a point where she snapped, a term Sheriff Salazar used to describe how the accumulated frustration and stress finally overwhelmed her ability to cope. The stabbing wasn't planned or premeditated in the traditional sense, but rather represented a sudden release of pent-up feelings that had no other outlet. However, the sustained nature of the attack, with more than 24 wounds, suggested that once Rachel began, she continued far beyond what any immediate impulse would explain. The fact that Rachel called law enforcement herself after the incident indicates some level of immediate recognition that what she had done was wrong. Rather than attempt to flee or create an alternative explanation, she took responsibility by contacting authorities and confessing. This choice to immediately report herself suggested she understood the gravity of her actions, even in the immediate aftermath. Given the circumstances surrounding the case, including Rachel's age, her caregiver role, and her immediate confession, she entered a plea of no contest rather than going to trial. A no contest plea means she didn't admit guilt, but acknowledged that the evidence against her was sufficient for a conviction. This type of plea often reflects a defendant's recognition that fighting the charges would be futile while still not making a direct admission of wrongdoing. Sentencing took place on August 27, 2025, less than a year after the incident. Rachel received 30 years in prison, a significant sentence that reflects the serious nature of taking a life while also considering the context of caregiver stress. She will serve this time in the Texas prison system, with eligibility for parole consideration after serving a portion of the sentence as determined by Texas law. Not every case begins with calculated greed or sudden rage. Sometimes years of suffering precede a breaking point that changes everything. Ashley Martinson. On March 7, 2015, authorities in Peel, Wisconsin, responded to a home where they would discover 2 adults who had lost their lives and 3 young girls locked in a room with food. The scene pointed to 17-year-old Ashley Martinson, who had fled with her boyfriend toward Indiana. What investigators would piece together was a story not just of what happened that day, but of years of circumstances that preceded it. Ashley had been living with her mother, Jennifer Ayers, who was 40 years old, and her stepfather, 37-year-old Thomas Ayers. The household included Ashley's younger stepsisters, who were unharmed in the incident. Evidence would later show that Thomas had subjected the household to years of harmful treatment, creating an environment where fear and control replaced the safety that should exist in a family home. The mistreatment included verbal attacks, physical harm, and even cruelty toward family pets, behaviors that demonstrated a pattern of domination and intimidation. The immediate trigger for the events of March 7th involved Ashley's boyfriend. Thomas had decided to punish Ashley regarding her relationship, imposing restrictions and consequences that felt unbearable to her given the years of accumulated grievances. This particular confrontation became the moment when Ashley decided she could no longer tolerate the situation she was trapped in. Ashley shot Thomas twice, ending his life. She then turned on her mother, Jennifer, stabbing her more than 30 times. The difference in methods used against each parent suggested different emotional states during each act, with the sustained nature of Jennifer's injuries indicating either sustained rage or the need to ensure she couldn't intervene or call for help. Before leaving, Ashley secured her stepsisters in a room with food and provisions, an act that may have reflected some concern for their welfare, even as she took the lives of their parents. Ashley and her boyfriend fled the scene, heading toward Indiana. They were apprehended during this flight, with law enforcement tracking their movements and intercepting them before they could reach whatever destination they had in mind. During the investigation that followed, evidence emerged about the household dynamics, including social media posts where Ashley had expressed her feelings about Thomas. A Facebook post from before the incident showed Ashley had written, "I want to end him so badly," using explicit language to express the depth of her hatred for her stepfather. This post would become evidence of her state of mind and the long-standing nature of her animosity. It demonstrated that the events of March 7th weren't a sudden impulse, but rather the culmination of feelings that had been building for some time. The legal proceedings had to balance the severity of what Ashley had done against the context of the household environment she had been living in. Prosecutors didn't deny that mistreatment had occurred, but argued that even in the face of such circumstances, taking 2 lives was not a justified response. The defense emphasized the years of suffering and the psychological impact of living under Thomas's control, suggesting that Ashley's actions, while extreme, were the desperate response of someone who felt she had no other escape. In 2016, Ashley pleaded guilty to second-degree charges, acknowledging her role in both deaths while avoiding a trial that would have required more extensive proceedings. The plea agreement resulted in a sentence of 23 years in prison, followed by 17 years of supervised release. The sentence reflected an attempt to hold Ashley accountable, while also recognizing that she had been a person in an extremely difficult situation. Judge Bloom, in imposing the sentence, told Ashley, "You did have a choice," emphasizing that, regardless of the circumstances she faced, taking lives rather than seeking help from authorities or other adults was a decision she made. The judge's statement captured the central tension in the case. The acknowledgement that Ashley had suffered while still maintaining that her response crossed lines that cannot be justified by that suffering. Ashley's younger stepsisters, who were locked in the room during the incident, lost both parents that day. While Thomas had been the source of mistreatment, Jennifer's role in the household and whether she had tried to protect her children or had been unable to stop Thomas's behavior became questions without clear answers. The girls faced the trauma of losing their parents and learning that their stepsister was responsible. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. Housing disputes within families can escalate in unexpected and tragic ways. Christina Ann Adams. In September 2022, law enforcement in Ocala, Florida, investigated a situation involving 33-year-old Christina Ann Adams and her parents, 74-year-old Richard Langer and his wife Sally Langer. Christina had been living with her parents, but tensions over this living arrangement had been escalating, culminating in her parents' decision to evict her from their home. For Christina, this eviction represented not just a housing crisis, but a rejection that triggered an extreme response. The day of the incident, Christina attacked both parents with a knife. She stabbed her father, Richard, repeatedly, inflicting injuries that proved fatal. She also attacked her mother, Sally, with the same weapon, stabbing her multiple times with the intent to take her life as well. Christina believed she had succeeded in ending both parents' lives and that they were deceased when she left the scene. After the attacks, Christina's actions demonstrated a disturbing level of detachment from what she had just done. She cleaned up the scene and then went shopping, carrying on as if she hadn't just committed violence against her own parents. This behavior suggested either shock, psychological dissociation, or a chilling lack of remorse about what had occurred. The shopping trip would later be documented through receipts and surveillance footage, providing a timeline of her movements after leaving her parents' home. What Christina didn't know was that her mother had survived. Sally, despite severe injuries, managed to get help. Her survival would prove crucial not just because a life was saved, but because she could provide first-hand testimony about what had happened. Sally's account would become central evidence in the case against Christina, eliminating any possibility of claiming an unknown intruder or alternative scenario. Christina was apprehended during a traffic stop, a routine interaction that turned into a homicide investigation when officers connected her to the incident. During initial questioning, her story contained inconsistencies that raised red flags for investigators. When confronted with these contradictions, Christina eventually confessed to attacking both parents, admitting that anger over the eviction had driven her actions. Her confession provided details that matched the physical evidence and Sally's account. The trial took place in April 2025, nearly 3 years after the incident. Prosecutors presented the confession, forensic evidence, Sally's testimony, and documentation of Christina's activities after the attacks. The defense had limited options given the strength of the evidence, particularly with a surviving victim who could directly identify Christina as the attacker. The jury heard about the eviction dispute, but apparently found it insufficient justification for the violence that resulted. The jury convicted Christina on multiple charges: first-degree charges for her father's death, and attempted charges for the attack on her mother. The convictions meant she faced severe sentencing that would effectively ensure she spent the rest of her life in prison. She received 2 life sentences, one for each conviction, to be served concurrently. The sentence meant no possibility of parole, no chance of release regardless of behavior or rehabilitation efforts. Financial inheritance can transform family relationships into battlegrounds. Sherry Lee Heffernan. In September 2021, emergency responders arrived at a home in Surf City, New Jersey, to discover 87-year-old John Enders and 75-year-old Françoise Pitoy, John's girlfriend. Both had suffered catastrophic injuries. John had been stabbed 51 times, while Françoise sustained 39 stab wounds. The sustained nature of the attacks indicated rage and determination, with the perpetrator continuing the assault far beyond what would have been necessary to incapacitate either victim. John's daughter, 57-year-old Sherry Lee Heffernan, became the immediate focus of the investigation. The motive quickly emerged: financial disputes over John's estate and his plans to sell his valuable beachfront property. Sherry had been cut from her father's will, a decision that meant she would receive nothing from his estate upon his passing. Additionally, John planned to sell his Surf City home, a property worth significant money that Sherry apparently believed should eventually come to her. The relationship between John and Françoise had complicated the family dynamics. As John's companion, Françoise was positioned to influence his decisions about his property and estate. For Sherry, Françoise represented not just a romantic rival for her father's attention, but also a barrier to what Sherry felt was rightfully hers. The decision to attack both John and Françoise suggested Sherry saw eliminating both as necessary to whatever plan she had conceived. Evidence collection proved extensive and damning. Investigators tracked Sherry's RV movements, analyzed cell phone data that placed her at the scene, and found bloody footprints that matched her shoes. The combination of technological tracking, physical evidence, and timeline documentation built an overwhelming case. The cell phone data showed her phone pinging towers near the crime scene during the relevant time period, while the RV tracking revealed she had driven to Surf City when she had no legitimate reason to be there. Despite this evidence, Sherry maintained her innocence throughout the investigation and trial. She claimed she was being framed, suggesting that someone else had committed these acts and planted evidence to implicate her. This defense strategy required the jury to believe that an elaborate conspiracy existed to make her appear guilty despite having no involvement. The prosecution countered by methodically presenting the evidence that placed her at the scene and connected her to the crimes. The prosecutor summarized the motive succinctly. She had 1.9 million plus reasons to want her father gone, referring to the value of John's estate and property. The statement captured how financial considerations had apparently overridden any family loyalty or love Sherry might have felt for her father. In the prosecutor's view, Sherry had calculated that taking her father's life would be worth it if it meant accessing wealth she felt entitled to. The trial in March 2024 resulted in convictions on all charges. The jury found Sherry guilty of ending both John's and Françoise's lives, rejecting her claims of being framed and accepting the prosecution's evidence. The verdict came after jurors deliberated on the extensive forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Sherry's own statements. In May 2024, Sherry received 2 life sentences, one for each victim. The sentences will run concurrently, but given her conviction on first-degree charges in New Jersey, she will never be eligible for parole. She will spend the rest of her life in the state prison system, with no possibility of release regardless of age or any rehabilitation she might demonstrate. Mental health conditions complicate the next case in profound ways. Jessica Camilleri. In July 2019, neighbors in Sydney, Australia, witnessed a disturbing scene when they discovered 25-year-old Jessica Camilleri in the street holding her mother's severed head. Inside the family home, 57-year-old Rita Camilleri's body bore evidence of more than 100 stab wounds. The extreme nature of the incident immediately raised questions about Jessica's mental state and what could have driven such an act. Jessica had been diagnosed with multiple psychiatric conditions. She lived with autism spectrum disorder and intellectual challenges that affected her ability to process emotions and control impulses. These conditions had been known to her family and had shaped the household dynamics for years. Rita had been Jessica's primary caregiver, managing her daughter's conditions while trying to maintain some semblance of normal family life, despite the challenges those conditions created. On the day of the incident, Jessica and Rita had an argument. The specifics of what triggered the disagreement remain unclear. But for Jessica, the argument escalated into rage that her conditions prevented her from controlling or tempering. What followed was a sustained attack that continued for an extended period, with Jessica stabbing her mother repeatedly. The attack didn't stop when Rita was incapacitated, but continued until Jessica had inflicted more than 100 wounds. After Rita had passed, Jessica's actions took an even more disturbing turn. She decapitated her mother's body, carrying the severed head outside where neighbors would encounter her. This behavior, while shocking, was consistent with someone experiencing a severe psychiatric episode rather than someone acting with calculated intent. Jessica was found at the scene, making no attempt to flee or hide what she had done. She was immediately taken into custody. The legal proceedings had to address the complex question of criminal responsibility when severe mental illness is involved. Prosecutors acknowledged Jessica's psychiatric conditions, but argued she understood the wrongfulness of her actions despite those conditions. The defense emphasized the severity of her illnesses, arguing that while Jessica might have some understanding that taking life was wrong, her condition severely impaired her ability to control her behavior or appreciate the full consequences of her actions. In 2021, a jury convicted Jessica of manslaughter rather than the more serious charge. The manslaughter conviction reflected the jury's acceptance that Jessica's mental health conditions had significantly impaired her culpability, while still finding that she bore some responsibility for what occurred. This middle ground between complete exoneration and full responsibility reflected the complexity of cases involving severe mental illness. The initial sentencing had to balance punishment with recognition of Jessica's psychiatric conditions. However, the case returned to the appeals court when questions arose about whether the sentence properly accounted for all relevant factors. In 2023, an appeals court reduced Jessica's sentence to 16 years, with eligibility for parole consideration in 2031. The reduced sentence reflected judicial determination that the original term hadn't properly weighted Jessica's diminished capacity due to her conditions. During the proceedings, Jessica made statements, including, "I just wanted to give her a little bit of a taste of her own medicine," suggesting she felt Rita had somehow wronged her and that the attack was retaliatory. This statement revealed Jessica's distorted perception of their relationship and her inability to recognize that whatever grievances she had against her mother didn't justify or explain the extreme response. Some cases involve deception that extends far beyond the initial act. Virginia McCullough. In June 2019, 70-year-old John McCullough and 71-year-old Lois McCullough were taken from their home in Essex, England, by their 36-year-old daughter, Virginia McCullough. What made this case particularly disturbing was not just the acts themselves, but what came afterward. Virginia would hide her parents' bodies in the house and continue living there for 4 years, maintaining an elaborate web of lies to explain their absence to family, friends, and authorities. Virginia poisoned her father with a combination of prescription medications, carefully administering doses that would take his life while potentially appearing to be natural causes if discovered. Her mother, Lois, presented a different challenge that led Virginia to use more direct methods. Virginia bludgeoned and stabbed Lois, inflicting multiple wounds that ensured she would not survive. The different methods suggested premeditation and planning, with Virginia choosing approaches tailored to each parent. After taking their lives, Virginia faced the problem of their bodies. Rather than report their passing or attempt to dispose of the remains elsewhere, she concealed them within the house. She kept her father's body in a makeshift tomb she constructed, while her mother's body was hidden in a sleeping bag. Virginia then continued living in the house, sleeping upstairs while her parents' remains stayed hidden below. The motivation was financial. Virginia began stealing from her parents' accounts immediately after their passing, eventually taking over £150,000. She continued collecting their pensions, using their money to fund her lifestyle while creating elaborate explanations for why they were never seen or available to speak with concerned relatives and friends. The deception required constant maintenance, with Virginia inventing stories about her parents being ill, traveling, or simply not wanting visitors. For 4 years, Virginia maintained this charade. She told family members that her parents were unwell and couldn't take calls. She invented medical conditions and doctor appointments. She created a complete fictional narrative about their lives to explain their absence from family gatherings and social obligations. The lengths she went to in order to maintain the lies demonstrated both cunning and a complete lack of remorse about what she had done. The deception finally unraveled when a doctor who had been treating one of her parents raised concerns. The medical professional's suspicions led to a welfare check, with authorities arriving at the home to investigate. When police came to the door, Virginia's years of deception came to an immediate end. What happened next revealed much about Virginia's character. Upon being arrested, she told the officers, "Cheer up, at least you've caught the bad guy," displaying a flippant attitude that shocked investigators. Her casual response to being caught, treating it almost as a game that she had lost, demonstrated a disturbing disconnect from the gravity of what she had done. There was no tearful confession, no expression of remorse, just a glib acknowledgement that her scheme had finally been discovered. During the investigation and trial, the full extent of Virginia's actions became clear. She had not just taken her parents' lives, but had then lived for years in the house with their concealed bodies, stealing their money and lying to everyone who asked about them. She pleaded guilty to the charges, perhaps recognizing that the evidence against her was insurmountable, or perhaps simply ready for the deception to end. In October 2024, Virginia received a life sentence with a minimum term of 36 years before she could be considered for parole. The lengthy minimum term reflected not just the acts themselves, but the years of deception that followed. The judge noted that Virginia valued money more than humanity, choosing financial gain over any familial loyalty or basic human decency. The final case brings together elements of youth, relationship conflict, and tragedy. Anna Schroeder. In July 2017, Emergency services responded to a fire at a home in Morrison, Illinois. When firefighters extinguished the blaze and searched the residence, they discovered 53-year-old Peggy Schroeder, who had been shot. The fire had been set in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence and create confusion about what had really occurred. Investigation would reveal that Peggy's teenage daughter, Anna Schroeder, was responsible, with her girlfriend, Rachel Helm, participating in the cover-up. Anna was 15 years old at the time, still living at home with her mother. The conflict centered on Anna's relationship with Rachel, which Peggy disapproved of for reasons that became central to understanding the motive. The relationship represented more than just a teenage romance. It symbolized Anna's growing independence and identity, areas where she felt her mother was trying to maintain control. The tension between wanting to live her own life and feeling constrained by parental authority created a powder keg situation. Anna shot her mother, ending Peggy's life in the home they shared. After the shooting, Anna and Rachel worked together to clean the scene, attempting to eliminate evidence that would point to them. They then set the fire, hoping it would consume any remaining traces and potentially make the death appear accidental, or the result of a home invasion gone wrong. The fire, however, didn't destroy everything, and investigators were able to determine that Peggy had been shot before the fire started. Anna fled to her father's home after the incident, a move that quickly drew investigator attention. The combination of physical evidence from the scene, witness statements, and Anna's own behavior led to her arrest. During the investigation, the relationship between Anna and Rachel emerged as the central motive, with prosecutors arguing that Anna had taken extreme measures to remove what she saw as an obstacle to her happiness. In 2020, Anna pleaded guilty to second-degree charges, accepting responsibility while avoiding the more serious first-degree conviction that might have resulted from a trial. The plea agreement likely reflected both the strength of the evidence against her and recognition that her youth at the time of the offense was a mitigating factor that deserved consideration. Sentencing took place in November 2021, more than 4 years after the incident. Anna received 20 years in prison, a substantial sentence that reflected the severity of taking her mother's life while also considering her status at the time. She will serve this sentence in the Illinois correctional system, with eventual eligibility for parole consideration after serving the required portion of her term. During proceedings, Anna acknowledged what she had done, stating, "I'm the child who shot and ended her own mom's life." The statement showed at least surface-level recognition of the gravity of her actions, though whether it represented genuine remorse or simply acknowledgement of facts remained unclear. The use of the third person to describe herself suggested some psychological distance from her actions. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.